Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Danakil Depression. 5 o'clock in the morning, January 17th, 2012. A camp of tourists is asleep near the rim of Bir Tawil, one of the only permanently active lava lakes on Earth, in a stretch of Ethiopia called the Afar region. Then gunmen walk into the camp. When it's over, 5 tourists are dead. 2 Germans, 2 Hungarians, 1 Austrian. 3 more are wounded. 4 people are dragged off into the dark, including 2 more Germans, and held for weeks before anyone sees them again. Ethiopia's government came out fast and named a culprit almost immediately: Eritrean-trained fighters. Eritrea denied training or arming anyone. No court, no tribunal, no international body of any kind ever settled who was actually responsible. And this wasn't the first time. 5 years earlier, in March 2007, an armed group calling itself the Afar Revolutionary Democratic Unity Front kidnapped 5 European tourists and 13 Ethiopians in this same desert. Everyone was eventually released, though some of the Ethiopians were held for more than a month. Ethiopia accused Eritrea of masterminding that one too. Eritrea blamed an Ethiopian rebel group instead. 5 years after the 2012 attack, in December 2017, a German tourist near Bir Tawil got separated from his group at night, wandered off the marked path, and approached armed guards from an unexpected direction in the dark. He was shot dead. Ethiopian officials later said it was probably a tragic mistake rather than a targeted attack, but the guards were only there in the first place because of what happened in 2012. The UK government's own travel guidance puts it in one blunt line: tourism in this area has been targeted by armed groups in 2007, 2012, and 2017. 3 separate attacks, 3 separate stretches of this century, the same patch of desert every time. So let's be precise about what's actually true here, because it's easy to get this wrong. Ethiopian federal police and armed escorts operate in the Danakil constantly, and if you go there as a tourist today, you're required to travel with one. The stranger fact sits one level up from that. No foreign government and no international peacekeeping force will maintain any presence here at all. And the reason cuts deeper than security. The border between Ethiopia and Eritrea, running directly through this depression, has never been physically marked on the ground, not once, not since the war that ended in 2000. Think about that. 2 governments signed a peace treaty. An international boundary commission spent years working out exactly where the line should go and delivered its final ruling in 2007. Eritrea accepted it. Ethiopia called the physical demarcation a legal fiction and refused to plant a single marker on the ground. So more than 2 decades after a war supposedly ended, the 2 countries that share this desert still can't agree on where one stops and the other starts. You can't patrol a line that doesn't exist yet on the actual dirt you'd be standing on. And underneath all of that political limbo, layered on top of a war that supposedly ended a quarter century ago, there's still ordnance. Landmines laid during that same 1998 to 2000 war are still down there, and this region is one of the 3 most heavily mine-contaminated zones in the entire country. Professional deminers only started systematically clearing this specific stretch in 2025. 25 years after the shooting stopped, somebody finally got around to checking whether the ground itself was still trying to kill people. It doesn't help that a short distance from all of this, a completely separate conflict has been simmering between Afar militias and ethnic Somali Isa clan militias over the same disputed farmland and grazing routes. A clash in April 2021 killed at least 100 people. Another in November 2022 killed at least 18 more. A ceasefire got brokered in 2024, but the actual land dispute underneath it was never resolved. Layer heat on top of all of that. Dalol, inside this same depression, holds one of the strongest claims to being the hottest inhabited adjacent place on the planet, based on a single dedicated study from the 1960s that clocked a mean annual temperature over 94 degrees Fahrenheit. With the hottest month averaging a daily high past 116 degrees, Dalol itself isn't really inhabited anymore. It's a depopulated, old mining outpost. The nearest actual town sits several miles away, for a reason. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though, and it isn't about the danger at all. It's about whether anything can even survive there. In 2019, 2 separate teams of scientists studied the exact same boiling, acidic brine pools at Dalol, and they walked away with opposite conclusions. One team found ultra-small microorganisms living in the salt formations, tiny enough that they're roughly 20 times smaller than an ordinary bacterium. The other team studied the harshest ponds themselves and found nothing, no life at all, not a trace. That second study is now cited as one of the best documented life-free environments ever found on the surface of this planet, and NASA treats the site as a legitimate stand-in for what the surface of Mars might actually look like. So picture that for a second. The same square mile of desert that scientists use to model where alien life might exist is also the exact spot other scientists point to as the closest thing on Earth to a place where life simply gives up trying. A depression where two nations still can't agree on their own shared border. Where the ordnance from their last war stayed active for a quarter century after the war itself ended. Where researchers can't even agree whether the ground is dead or alive. And this isn't even the desert with the strangest disappearance story on this list. It's not even close. Number 2. The Rub al Khali. Late December 2023, somewhere around 250 miles off the main highway inside the empty quarter. Ahmed al-Menhali, a 39-year-old Emirati government employee, tries a shortcut through soft sand in his Nissan Patrol. All 4 tires bury themselves instantly. His phone has no signal. He has some croissants, a few sweets, and 10 boxes of bottled water, and that's it. For 4 straight days, he stays with the vehicle, rationing everything, gathering firewood he never actually burns, praying, sleeping under blankets in the cab at night. On the evening of January 2nd, 2024, a convoy of 12 vehicles searching for him drives right past without seeing him. He grabs his phone, flashes the light, and they stop. He later said it was the hardest situation of his life. He survived. Months later, in August 2024, a 27-year-old telecom worker named Mohammed Shehzad died of exhaustion in that same desert after his group's GPS failed and their vehicle ran dry. And that wasn't even the part that got people talking, because people have been trying and failing to conquer this stretch of sand for close to a century. In 1930, a British explorer named Bertram Thomas made the first documented western crossing, guided by a tribal sheikh named Saleh bin Khalid, who navigated by nothing but memory and the stars, covering roughly 600 miles in 59 days. 2 years later, another British explorer, St. John Philby, crossed it the other direction with 32 camels provided by the King of Saudi Arabia himself, covering close to 1,700 miles in 90 days, and Philby later wrote that even some of the camels died along the way. While he was out there hunting for a legendary lost city, Philby stumbled onto something nobody expected, a set of craters filled with black glass and iron fragments, the largest one holding a 2-ton meteorite that locals nicknamed the Camel's Hump. That chunk of space rock had been sitting in the open desert for centuries, maybe linked to a fireball people in Riyadh reported seeing back in the 1800s, just waiting undiscovered in a desert that still swallows GPS-equipped SUVs today. Wilfred Thesiger made his own crossings in the late 1940s and documented something even nastier on the desert's Omani edge, a salt marsh called al-Samim, which translates roughly to Mother of Poisons. It looks like solid ground. It isn't. The crust can give way underneath you without warning, and there are accounts of entire camel herds dying after breaking through it in a single afternoon. Here's the detail that everyone misses about this place, though, and it explains why no map of this region has ever shown a real military presence in the middle of it. This desert is roughly the size of France, and holds about half as much sand as the entire Sahara, with dunes that pile up as high as 800 feet in places. That's not a rolling hill of sand. That's a building you'd need an elevator for, and it can be somewhere else entirely by the time you come back a week later. No standing army has ever tried to hold or patrol the true interior. Not Saudi forces, not Omani forces, not the British. During the Dhofar War in the 1960s and 70s, the Sultan of Oman's forces, backed by British troops and the SAS, fought Marxist rebels almost entirely in the mountains, ringing the desert's edge. The sand sea itself just sat there the whole war, untouched, because it was tactically useless ground that no force on either side could actually survive in long enough to use it. I mean, think about how far that goes. In 1994, a private scientific expedition set out for the meteorite craters with military-grade Hummers and an armed Saudi Border Patrol escort riding along for protection. Partway through, after the group briefly strayed into Yemen during that country's civil war, The Border Patrol's own commanding officer left the expedition and turned back. The soldiers assigned to protect the crossing couldn't even finish it themselves. A U.S. Geological Survey scientist on that same trip, a man named Jeffrey Wynne, recorded a field temperature of 142 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade at the crater site, not in the sun. In the shade, one of the astronomers who later joined that expedition, Gene Shoemaker, went on to co-discover the comet that eventually crashed into Jupiter. And it isn't only scientists and government convoys who've had trouble getting through this ground. Back in 1950, a U.S. Air Force team made the first ever mechanized crossing of this desert, driving trucks from the city of Dhahran all the way to central Yemen and back, partly just to test whether American desert survival procedures actually worked out here at all. Along the modern Saudi-Yemen border, which runs for close to 1,100 miles largely through this same desert, security analysts studying the region don't describe a patrolled frontier at all. They describe a smuggling corridor that operates almost entirely under the world's radar, moving militants, weapons, and migrants through terrain too vast and too hostile for either government to actually control on the ground. Bertram Thomas's guide crossed this exact ground, using nothing but the stars and a lifetime of memorized terrain, and it still nearly killed both of them. Which raises an uncomfortable question for what's coming next, because the desert we're heading to now doesn't just resist a compass. Its own name, in the local language, is popularly translated as a warning that once you're in, you're not coming back out. Number 3. The Taklamakan Desert. April 10th, 1895. The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin rides out of the city of Kashgar, planning to cut straight across the desert's interior to reach the Khotan River. He has badly misjudged how much water that plan requires. Within days, his camels start collapsing. By his own account, 7 of them die of thirst before the crossing is over, along with 2 of his escorts. Hedin pushes ahead alone on horseback with a single servant, and when that servant collapses too, Hedin leaves him in the sand, reaches water at what he later describes as the last possible moment, and then turns around to go save him. For over a century, it stood as one of the great survival stories in the history of exploration. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. In the year 2000, a German explorer named Bruno Baumann retraced Hedin's exact route by camel caravan to test the story, and it fell apart under him. He found that at least one of the men Hedin claimed had died had actually survived. And doing the math on water and camel capacity for that specific route in that specific season, he concluded there was no physical way the caravan could have carried enough water for both the men and the animals in the first place. Hedin, it turns out, likely dramatized his own near-death experience for the book he later published about it. He wasn't the only one who nearly didn't make it out. 13 centuries earlier, around 630 CE, the Buddhist monk Xuanzang lost his water supply, crossing near this same desert's frontier watchtowers, and reportedly went 5 days without a single drop before finding an oasis. Centuries after that Buddhist monk's crossing, a British-Hungarian archaeologist named Aurel Stein ran 4 separate Central Asian expeditions between 1900 and 1930, excavating a buried oasis settlement in this same desert, and eventually dying in Kabul in 1943, still working in the field at the very end. Then, in 1934, another archaeologist, a Swede named Folke Bergman, located an ancient burial ground here, guided by a local hunter, containing the largest concentration of naturally mummified bodies found at any single site on Earth. Then the site was lost again, swallowed back into the dunes, and nobody managed to relocate it until a Chinese team used GPS in the year 2000. And when scientists finally ran genetic testing on those mummies in 2021, publishing in the journal Nature, they overturned decades of assumptions. Everyone had figured these Western-looking remains meant European or Central Asian migrants had settled here in the Bronze Age. Instead, the DNA showed a population that was genetically isolated, with deep, entirely indigenous Asian roots the whole time. Nobody had migrated in from anywhere. They'd just always been there. Here's the pattern that runs through every single era of this place. No organized force, in any century, has ever actually tried to hold the center of this desert. Han Dynasty garrisons, 2,000 years ago, were built strictly on the desert's rim, at oasis towns ringing the sand, specifically so soldiers could control trade without ever setting foot in the interior itself. Silk Road caravans split into northern and southern routes that skirted the edges for the exact same reason, and that pattern hasn't changed in 2 millennia. Some of China's most advanced modern military infrastructure in this region, full-scale mock-ups of an American aircraft carrier and destroyer escorts, built for missile targeting practice, sits on the desert's eastern edge near the town of Ruoqiang, not in the Dune Sea itself. Even the modern Tarim Desert Highway, a road built through the 1990s to finally connect the two sides, needed geotextile reinforced roadbeds and more than 20 million planted trees just to keep a single 2-lane strip of pavement from being buried by the dunes it runs through. It took until 1993 for any human expedition to complete a full crossing of the untouched interior, and even then it took 30 camels, a dedicated resupply team, and Chinese government officials embedded in the group for political reasons. As recently as 2016, an adventurer named Rob Lilwall, attempting a solo crossing, was pulled over by Chinese police twice and physically driven around closed drilling zones for a combined 75 miles during his 71-day trip, which cost him any claim to being the first person to cross it entirely alone. That's not a typo, by the way. This desert covers roughly 130,000 square miles, just a bit smaller than Germany, and 85% of it is made up of mobile dunes, some nearly 300 feet tall, that erase tracks and landmarks overnight. Recorded temperatures here swing from nearly 27 below zero in winter up past 113 degrees in summer, with barely an inch of rain across an entire year. If you're the kind of person who wants to keep finding places like this, ones nobody's actually in control of, go ahead and subscribe now, because we've still got 7 more of these to get through. And the desert's own nickname carries a warning that sounds almost too perfect. It's usually translated for outsiders as, "Go in and you won't come out." Except that translation itself turns out to be a myth. Linguists actually argue over where the name even comes from, some tracing it to an old word for a place of abandonment, others to a term for a place of ruins, others to an ancient people called the Tocharians, with one documented Uyghur form of the name only traced back as far as 1867. The scariest version of the name is the one that survives in travel brochures, and travel brochures don't get peer-reviewed. Number 4. Bir Tawil. June 16, 2014. A farmer from Virginia named Jeremiah Heaton drives into a restricted desert zone on the Egypt-Sudan border and plants a homemade flag in the sand. He declares it the Kingdom of North Sudan, crowns himself king, and names his 6-year-old daughter Emily as princess, because she'd asked him if she could really be one, and he didn't want to break the promise. No government on Earth recognized it. Neither did the United Nations. It made global headlines anyway, complete with a documentary deal and a plan to build an agricultural research center, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, because a journalist named Jack Schenker had already done the exact same thing 3 years earlier, and nobody cared. In January 2011, Schenker, on assignment for The Guardian, secured Egyptian military clearance, drove 14 hours through restricted canyons, then pushed another 40 hours overland from inside Sudan, and planted his own joke flag in that same patch of desert. 0 headlines. The princess story went around the world within days. The journalism sat there for 3 years before anyone noticed. Here's what actually makes this patch of desert unclaimed, and it's not an accident or an oversight, and it's not a gap anyone simply forgot to fill in over the last century and a quarter. Britain drew 2 different borders here decades apart. In 1899, the line was set along the 22nd parallel. In 1902, a separate administrative boundary was drawn to reflect which tribes actually used which land, and that line shifted this exact strip, called Bir Tawil, north into Egyptian territory, while handing a much more valuable piece of Red Sea coastline, called the Halaib Triangle, over to Sudan instead. So now Egypt insists on the 1899 line because that line gives Egypt the valuable coastline. Sudan insists on the 1902 line for exactly the same reason, in reverse. And here's the trap. Whichever line a country picks also legally hands them this desert strip as a consolation prize neither one actually wants. So neither government will plant a flag here, because doing it would mean giving up their claim to the real prize sitting right next door. 3 years after Heaton's stunt, in November 2017, 2 more people showed up within a single day of each other, apparently without either one knowing the other was coming. An Indian businessman named Suyash Dixit declared his own kingdom and planted sunflower seeds as a founding ritual. A Russian DJ named Dmitry Zhikarev showed up the very next day, declared a competing kingdom of his own, and publicly accused both Heaton and Dixit of faking their trips entirely. Neither claim went anywhere either. And the stunts kept coming after that, just with less attention each time. In September 2019, a Lebanese-American businesswoman named Nadera Nassif backed a claim framed around refugee aid instead of a personal crown. More recently, a group calling itself the Principality of Bir Tawil has claimed several thousand citizens on paper and even filed a request with the United Nations for observer status, a claim that traces back only to the group's own website, not to any outside reporting that's verified it. Here's the detail almost nobody covers, though. This land isn't actually empty of authority. It's just empty of governments. Ababda and Bashari nomadic tribes have lived across this exact ground for generations, long before any European drew a line through it, and they don't recognize any of these flag-planting stunts as meaningful in the slightest. There's also a genuinely ironic detail buried in the name itself. Bir Tawil translates roughly to tall water well, and there is no surface water anywhere in the roughly 800 square miles this territory actually covers. The highest point rises to just over 2,100 feet, and summer highs regularly push past 100 degrees. Despite the total absence of water, unregulated gold miners still work camps scattered across the territory, using mercury to extract gold from crushed ore, a method that's cheap and effective and quietly poisoning the same ground everyone keeps claiming as a kingdom. Reports from guides who've actually led groups through describe armed mercenaries and weapons dealers tied to Sudan's broader conflicts moving through the same territory as the gold camps. One expedition guide leading a group through in 2022 put the actual balance of power about as bluntly as you can. "They have guns," he told his clients, "so we have to listen to them." And there's one more irony sitting underneath all of it. Maybe the sharpest one on this entire list so far, sharper even than a nomadic tribe enforcing more actual authority over a piece of land than either of the two nations that supposedly border it. To even attempt reaching this land that belongs to no country, you first have to cross Egypt's heavily militarized, permit only restricted border zone, and separately apply to Sudanese authorities just to buy a detailed map of the region. The desert, with zero government inside it, is only reachable with a government's written permission to get there in the first place. That exact same trick, using old colonial paperwork to quietly dump a problem onto whoever's left holding it, shows up again a few deserts from now. Except in the next one, the leftover paperwork isn't creating an accidental kingdom nobody wants. It's the reason people are disappearing into a dust storm this year. Number 5. Dasht-e Margo, Afghanistan's Desert of Death. July 19th, 2026. A vehicle carrying 20 Afghan migrants trying to cross illegally into Iran breaks down in this desert, in Nimroz province. The driver and one passenger head off on foot to find help. A severe dust storm rolls in. The other 19 scatter in the wind and vanish. Search helicopters look for 4 straight days and find nothing, and a provincial government spokesman confirms the search is still ongoing, with no trace of anyone recovered. It isn't the first time this exact thing has happened here. In October 2023, at least 17 migrants died in this same desert after their smuggler abandoned them over a dispute about payment, leaving them stranded with no water in a landscape that spans roughly 150,000 square miles, the world's 20th largest desert, with no permanent settlements anywhere in its actual core. And that wasn't even the worst part. Afghanistan is one of only 7 countries on Earth classified as massively contaminated by landmines, in the same company as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Iraq, Turkey, and Ukraine. The 2 provinces that make up this desert, Nimruz and Helmand, sit right at the center of that contamination. Helmand specifically is documented as the single most mine and unexploded ordnance-affected province in the entire country. Historical estimates, compiled with help from Soviet military engineers who handed over minefield data when they withdrew in 1989, put the total number of mines laid at somewhere between 250,000 and 270,000, most of them planted as security belts around towns, garrisons, and roads, with more scattered loosely across trails and pastures that nobody ever mapped properly in the first place. Here's the number that should stop you, more than any single casualty figure could. In 2011, Afghanistan had roughly 15,000 trained deminers working to clear this stuff out of the ground. Today, that number is around 1,300. The workforce collapsed by more than 90% in a little over a decade. right as international funding dried up and programs got frozen or canceled outright. And the people paying for that collapse are disproportionately children. In the most recent tracked year, 77% of landmine casualties in this country were kids, and roughly 54 people a month are still being killed or maimed by leftover explosives nationwide. More than 40,000 Afghans have died this way since Soviet forces withdrew back in 1989. A 2025 Landmine Monitor report ranked Afghanistan third in the world for recorded casualties that year, behind only Myanmar and Syria, with 624 people killed or injured. Clearing this stuff isn't safe work either. In 2021, gunmen linked to a regional offshoot of the Islamic State attacked a demining camp in a different Afghan province, killing 10 workers and wounding 16 more, most of them from a single ethnic minority community. The organizations still operating here, including one of the largest demining charities in the world, have destroyed close to 860,000 landmines across the country since the 1980s, cleared well over 100,000 hectares of land, and currently keep roughly 600 staff working the country. And it still isn't close to enough. A 2025 funding freeze from one of the program's biggest international donors stalled or shut down multiple clearance projects outright, which is a direct part of why the workforce numbers collapsed in the first place. Now, to be precise about this, because it matters, and precision is the entire point of putting together a list like this one in the first place. There's no official record of NATO or coalition forces ever declaring this specific desert a formal no-go zone. Nobody signed a document saying stay out. What actually happened is simpler and somehow worse. The danger here comes from a compounding stack of separate hazards. Old Soviet minefields, nobody fully mapped, extreme heat, zero permanent water, and now a collapsing demining effort. And that stack has made sustained presence here practically impossible without anyone ever having to declare it off limits on paper. If you're wondering how a war that ended in 1989 is still killing people in 2026, so is every mine clearance organization trying to keep up with it. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. The thing actively killing people in this desert right now isn't the Cold War leftovers at all. It's smuggling. International migration officials recorded roughly 1,300 Afghan deaths on the Afghanistan to Iran crossing route in 2025 alone, and this stretch of desert has quietly become one of the deadliest migration corridors in all of Asia, happening largely independent of, and in parallel with, the landmines that made this place infamous in the first place. Two completely different eras of death, stacked on top of each other, in the same patch of sand, and neither one is winding down. Which brings up an uncomfortable comparison, and it's worth sitting with before we move on. A vanished 55-year-old scientist, a genuine state secret waiting to be uncovered next, a search involving over 100 people, dozens of vehicles, and nearly 30 aircraft sorties, all of it organized by a government with every resource available to a modern state, and still nothing found. If a country's own military, hunting for one of its own most senior scientists, can lose that fight to a desert, what actually happens when 19 exhausted strangers get caught in a dust storm with no resources at all, and nobody with a fleet of aircraft looking specifically for them? Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. Lop Nur. 10:30 in the morning, June 17th, 1980. The dunes at the edge of the Lop Nur Salt Basin, a place locals call the Sea of Death. Peng Jiamu, 55 years old, a biochemist and vice president of the Xinjiang branch of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, is 5 days into leading a state expedition, attempting the first ever, west to east, crossing of this dried lake bed. The team's fuel and water are critically low. They radio for a military resupply and are told to sit tight and wait. Peng doesn't wait. He scrawls a note, 6 characters, saying he's gone east to find a well, grabs a canvas bag and a water bottle, and walks alone into the dunes. He is never seen again. His teammates follow his footprints until they simply stop at the edge of the basin. The only thing anyone ever recovered was a candy wrapper. Peng had a habit of carrying hard candy and sharing it with the team wherever he went. And this was the 4th expedition of his career into this exact basin. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because China did not treat this as one missing man in an empty desert, According to Chinese reporting, 4 separate large-scale search operations were mounted across more than 1,500 square miles of terrain, spread out over the following weeks. 117 personnel, 48 vehicles, 29 aircraft sorties. And they found nothing. A modern state, using military aircraft and ground vehicles and well over 100 trained people, could not locate one of its own most senior scientists in this desert. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about why this place stayed sealed off long after the search ended. Lop Nur wasn't just remote. It was China's only nuclear proving ground. 45 atmospheric and underground detonations between 1964 and 1996, starting with the country's first ever nuclear test and ending the year before Beijing announced a formal testing moratorium. A Japanese physicist named Jun Takada, working entirely from Soviet detonation records and radiation data collected in neighboring Kazakhstan since he couldn't access the site directly, modeled radiation levels in parts of the surrounding region that in places exceeded what's been measured on Chernobyl's own reactor roof, and separately estimated close to 200,000 acute radiation deaths across the wider population. To be clear, that's Takada's own modeled estimate, not an official government figure, and he called it a conservative minimum himself. Separate advocacy groups have reported regional cancer rates running 30 to 35% above the national average, though those figures come from organizations with their own political stake in the story, so treat them as reported claims rather than settled fact. For years afterward, rumors chased Peng's disappearance in every direction imaginable. In 2005, and again in 2007, mummified remains turned up in the region that briefly looked like they might be his. Both times, people who had personally known him examined the bodies and ruled them out. A 1980 tabloid claimed that he'd been spotted alive in a restaurant in Washington, D.C., was denied by his own widow, and called a hoax by the state news agency. There was even a lower credibility theory, traced back to a single ideologically driven outlet, claiming his own teammates had killed him in a dispute and the government covered it up. That's not a typo, by the way. That theory really exists, but there's no credible evidence behind it, and it should be treated as exactly what it is. Unconfirmed rumor, not fact. Sven Hedin, the same explorer whose near-death crossing of the Taklamakan we already covered, actually solved a genuine mystery here decades earlier. In 1900, surveying this same region, he discovered the ruins of an ancient city called Lulan, buried under sand for over 1,000 years, complete with a horse cart wheel and hundreds of documents written on wood, paper, and silk. Ancient travelers had long believed this basin's lake physically wandered around the map on its own, appearing in different spots across different centuries. Hedin proved that wasn't true. The lake hadn't moved. It had simply dried up and reformed elsewhere as the river feeding it kept shifting course, a process that, combined with upstream damming in the 20th century, eventually dried the whole basin out completely from a lake covering thousands of square miles, as recently as the early 1900s, down to nothing at all today. Peng Jiamu wasn't a stranger to this basin either. His very first expedition here, back in 1964, measured hundreds of thousands of tons of potassium salt accumulating in the dried lakebed every year, and cataloged dozens of plant and animal species nobody had properly documented before. He knew this ground about as well as any scientist alive could. It still wasn't enough to bring him home 16 years later. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you more than any of the history. This is not some abandoned Cold War ruin slowly being reclaimed by sand. Satellite analysis published in 2025 found that China built new infrastructure at this exact site between 2020 and 2024, including what appears to be the first new underground test shaft construction in nearly 50 years. Almost 3 decades after China's own declared nuclear testing moratorium, this restricted zone is not shrinking. It's actively growing, right now, while you're watching this. A vanished scientist that a state with every resource couldn't find. A radiation legacy modeled to rival one of history's worst nuclear disasters. And a restricted military zone that's quietly expanding again in the present day, decades after everyone assumed the story here was over. If you want to know what happens when that kind of secrecy collides with an actual military failure out in the open, in a war fought over a completely different desert, stick around, because that's exactly where we're headed next. Number 7. The Aouzou Strip. September 5th, 1987, Matan al-Sara Air Base, deep inside Libyan-held territory in the Sahara. Chadian forces under President Hissène Habré stage a surprise raid using nothing but pickup trucks mounted with French-supplied anti-tank missiles against a fortified Libyan garrison backed by real armor. Roughly 1,000 Libyan troops are killed, 300 captured, hundreds more flee straight into the open desert. Chad's own losses are light by comparison, and the war is effectively over within days, with a ceasefire signed less than a week later. Western reporters started calling it the Toyota War, because Chad had received something like 400 Toyota pickups by that point and used them to run circles around Soviet-supplied tanks that outweighed them by tons. It was the decisive, final phase of a wider Chadian-Libyan war that had already been dragging on since 1978, and Libya had actually occupied this strip of desert since 1973, nearly a decade before the fighting escalated this far. Casualty figures vary depending on who's counting. Some Western sources put total Libyan losses across the whole 1987 campaign at around 7,500 killed, close to a tenth of Libya's entire army, along with roughly 800 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed or captured, and around 30 aircraft lost, at a cost estimated near $1.5 billion in Libyan equipment. Chad's own losses across that same campaign ran around 1,000 killed. Different sources land on different numbers for the individual battles, but every version of the story ends the same way. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, and it wasn't even really about tactics. It was about a 44,000 square mile strip of Sahara that Libya had occupied for 2 decades, chasing a territorial claim that the International Court of Justice finally threw out in 1994, ruling 16-1 that an old 1955 treaty had already fixed the border and awarding the entire strip to Chad. A UN observer group verified Libya's full troop withdrawal by the end of May that same year. One popular explanation for why Libya wanted this patch of desert so badly points to rumored uranium deposits underneath it. That claim traces back to hedged 1983 Wire reporting that only ever said, possibly rich in uranium, and no full-scale mining ever actually happened there. A specific figure of over 100,000 tons of uranium gets repeated online constantly, and it traces to nothing but an unverified AI-generated wiki entry. It doesn't check out. Don't repeat it. Here's the problem with a war that technically ended in 1994 on paper, though. Retreating Libyan forces packed this strip with landmines and, according to a 1999 Human Rights Watch report, withdrew without ever handing over maps or marking a single one. That same report cites Chadian military estimates running location by location, roughly 10,000 mines around Aouzou itself, more than 30,000 around a nearby town called Wur, another 10,000 near Audi Doum, and thousands more scattered across at least 2 other named locations, with roughly a third of all devices booby-trapped, and at least 22 different mine types identified from multiple supplier countries. And more than 30 years after that legal ruling, this strip still hasn't been cleared. A demining group has worked the wider Tibesti region, which includes Aouzou, since 2004, but as of 2024, Chad was granted its 5th extension on its international mine clearance deadline, now pushed all the way out to 2030, after survey work in the region stalled for 2 straight years running, for lack of funding. If you're enjoying finding out just how many of these places are still armed decades after the shooting officially stopped, subscribe, because we've still got 3 more to go, and they only get stranger from here. But what's happening in that same strip of desert right now makes the actual war look like the easy part. Since a gold rush began there in 2013, drawing an estimated 300,000 prospectors into the wider region, miners chasing gold have been driving trucks and digging directly into 1980s Libyan minefields that were never mapped in the first place. In 2024, a vehicle carrying 10 gold miners struck a mine at a site called Tanua, and 8 of them were killed. That's not an isolated tragedy. A nearly identical incident at that exact same location in 2021 also killed 8 people. 2 mass casualty events, 3 years apart, same coordinates, same cause. The regional governor was blunt about it afterward, saying flatly that the entire province is littered with mines laid by the Libyan army during that war, and that heavy rains have since started washing more of them onto roadways, forcing emergency crews to scramble every time a new one turns up somewhere nobody expected it. A resolved legal dispute, an unresolved minefield, and a fresh industry driving straight into a decades-old war it has nothing to do with. Residents in the town of Aouzou itself have told reporters that nearly every family there has lost someone to a mine over the years, including the village's own administrative head, who lost a brother that way in 1998, 4 years after the International Court of Justice supposedly settled the whole dispute for good. That's the real story of this strip, not the pickup trucks. And it's not the only desert on this list where the actual killing is coming from something that has nothing to do with heat or thirst. Up next is a desert that holds the literal record for the hottest ground temperature ever measured on this entire planet. And it turns out that record isn't even the most dangerous thing about it. Number 8. Dasht-e Lut, Iran. In 2005, NASA's MODIS satellite instrument, flying aboard a pair of orbiting spacecraft called Aqua and Terra, registered a ground temperature of 159.3 degrees Fahrenheit at a plateau inside this desert called Gandum Berrian. That is the highest land surface temperature ever recorded on this planet at the time, measured from orbit rather than by any instrument standing on the ground itself. Researchers at the University of Montana published the finding in 2011 after analyzing years of satellite data spanning 2003 through 2009, and this exact spot came out as the single hottest location on Earth in 5 of those 7 years. A later reanalysis in 2021 pushed the real figure even higher, closer to 177 degrees, tying it with a stretch of Mexico's Sonoran Desert for the hottest ground ever measured anywhere. That's not a typo, by the way. That's a ground reading, not an air temperature, which is actually a different measurement entirely. Death Valley still holds the official record for the hottest recorded air temperature from all the way back in 1913, a figure that stood unbroken for well over a century. What NASA's satellites caught here is something else entirely. The literal surface of the Earth, hot enough in the shade of nothing at all to blister through footwear in minutes, in a spot with no shade for miles in any direction to test that theory against. This desert was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016, covering more than 5.5 million acres across 3 separate Iranian provinces: Kerman, Sistan, Baluchistan, and South Khorasan. It was cited partly for containing the tallest, longest, and most continuous wind-carved rock formations on the planet, called kaluts locally, some ridges running over 130 feet high and stretching more than 25 miles, sculpted entirely by one consistent prevailing wind grinding down ancient lakebed sediment over thousands of years. These formations cover roughly a third of the desert's total area, which means an actual third of this UNESCO-listed landscape is built from wind-carved ridges taller than most buildings, with nothing living on or around most of them. But the real headline is that one plateau, Gandum Berrian, which translates roughly to roasted wheat, supposedly named because a shipment of grain left there once scorched within days. Researchers studying it have documented something almost unbelievable. No recorded plant life, no animal life, not even bacteria. A genuinely, scientifically sterile stretch of ground, roughly 185 square miles of it, sitting inside one of the most extensively studied deserts on the planet. And somehow, people have still tried to live inside that. A French-Swiss explorer named Christian Clot completed a documented solo, 30-day traverse of this desert in 2016 and 2017, tracking his own heart rate and cognitive decline the entire way. Forced to stay completely motionless for roughly 12 hours a day just to avoid heat stroke, as part of a wider project testing how much heat the human body and mind can actually absorb before something breaks. He wasn't testing survival gear or breaking a speed record. He was there specifically to measure how his own brain degraded under conditions that, on paper, a person shouldn't be able to willingly endure for 30 minutes, let alone 30 days. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you, though. Despite that one plateau being scientifically confirmed as lifeless, researchers working the wider desert keep finding insects, reptiles, and actual desert foxes surviving in stretches with no visible plant life to support any of them at all. A 2016 report in the journal Science called it an unsolved food web mystery, sitting inside one of the most extensively studied deserts on Earth, and nobody has fully explained it since. Something is feeding something out there. Nobody studying the site can say exactly what or how far up the chain it goes. None of that recorded heat is even the only reason this particular stretch of Iran stays empty of any organized presence. The wider region straddles Iran's Sistan Baluchistan province, which has its own long-running, low-level insurgency, and heavy cross-border smuggling of fuel and narcotics, an entirely separate deterrent that has nothing to do with temperature at all, and one that's been documented by regional security researchers as an ongoing source of instability independent of anything happening in the desert itself. So even if the ground here weren't hot enough to blister skin through boots, there'd still be a second, completely unrelated reason no organized force wants to spend much time out here. To be fair to the heat itself, though, this desert doesn't need politics to keep people out. A landscape confirmed to have zero water, zero shelter, and in places zero life of any kind doesn't need a government to declare it off limits. It enforces that rule on its own, with satellite instruments, not decrees, and it's been enforcing it long before anyone had a satellite to measure it with. If you're wondering how absolutely nothing at all survives on that one specific plateau, so are the actual scientists still studying it. And that same question, what does it take to build something meant to survive when every living thing around it can't, is exactly what drove one particular French general to spend 2 decades trying to master a completely different desert. It went about as well as you'd expect. Number 9. The Tanezrouft. February 18, 1920. General Henri Laperrine, the French officer known as the man who pacified the Sahara, is surveying from the air when his plane runs short of fuel and crash lands roughly 60 miles off course, deep inside the Tanezrouft, close enough to a well that rescue should have been simple. Badly injured, he orders his 2 companions to leave him behind and save themselves. He keeps a logbook as his condition worsens over the following days. He dies of exhaustion on March 5th, more than 2 weeks after the crash. His companions are rescued by a relief column 9 days after that, after a French lieutenant leading the search party had already been out looking across open desert for close to 3 weeks straight. Let's be accurate about who Laperrine actually was, because the popular version of this story usually gets it wrong, and getting it wrong misses the actual point. The popular assumption is that this was Foreign Legion territory. It wasn't. Laperrine founded France's camel-mounted Desert Corps back in 1902, specifically to bring this exact stretch of desert under French control, recruiting locally and training soldiers to survive on terrain that broke conventional units. The Legion didn't even get its own dedicated motorized Saharan units until 1940, 2 decades after Laperrine was already dead. The man who built the entire system meant to conquer the Tanezrouft died alone inside it, using the very expertise he'd spent his whole career developing, and it still wasn't enough to get him out alive. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the desert didn't get any easier to hold after he died either. Reference sources describe the Tanezrouft as notoriously flat, featureless, and without wells, receiving less than an inch of rain most years, with summer highs regularly topping 125 degrees, spread across a stretch of Sahara roughly 600 miles from north to south. The historic crossing route between the towns of Regane and Gao runs roughly 800 miles, first mapped for motor vehicles by a French expedition in 1923. Starting that same decade, the company running that route began marking it with waypoints, roughly every 60 miles. Since a driver with no landmarks and no fuel reserve had no real way to know how far they'd actually come. The most famous of them, a stop called Biden V, started out as literally nothing more than an empty fuel drum with the number 5 painted on it. It wasn't upgraded into an actual camp with a radio until 1930, got a proper fuel station later that same year, and airplane refueling capability by 1934. And the well at that same waypoint, the entire reason anyone stopped there in the first place, wasn't even confirmed to hold drinkable water until January of 1942. 2 full decades after motor vehicles started using this route regularly, the most critical stop on the whole crossing still couldn't guarantee its own water. France's first nuclear test, codenamed Gerboise Bleu, detonated on February 13, 1960, near Regane, the northern gateway town into this same desert, with testing continuing into the following years under a later agreement with the newly independent Algerian government, and documented elevated cancer rates among the local population exposed to it. It's the same story we already covered a few deserts back, a different government, a different decade, the exact same instinct. Build the bomb in the emptiest place you can find, then never fully leave. And this desert hasn't actually quieted down since, in any real sense of the word. Tuareg rebels seized the fortress town of Tessalit, which anchors the route's southern end, back in 2012. French paratroopers retook it the following February. A senior leader of Al-Qaeda's regional branch was killed by French forces near that same town in 2020. France's broader military operation across this region, which at its peak covered 5 countries across the Sahel, ran for 8 years before withdrawing entirely from Mali in 2022, a pullout the French president tied publicly to his government's unwillingness to keep fighting alongside a partner government he said was negotiating with the same militants France had been sent to fight. As of this year, the UK government's own travel guidance advises against all travel to the entire country, citing a high threat of kidnapping and criminal activity on the highways, and separately warns against traveling within about 20 miles of Algeria's own southern border. Neither government fully controls this ground today. Armed groups run their own checkpoints instead, on the exact same route Le Perine's Camel Corps once patrolled, and one of the few Algerian towns still standing inside the Tanezrouft draws its water from wells 400 feet deep because no natural oasis exists there at all. The most famous landmark on this entire crossing was, for years, actual garbage. A discarded oil drum with a number painted on it. And the man who spent his whole career building the system meant to hold this desert still died stranded and exhausted inside it, 2 weeks into writing down his own condition in a logbook nobody found in time to save him. Which brings us to the last desert on this list, and the one that ends up outlasting every single story we've covered so far, by a margin measured not in years or even decades, but in tens of thousands of years. End quote. Number 10. Maralinga. 7 o'clock in the morning, October 15th, 1953. Britain detonates its first nuclear device on the Australian mainland, a 9.1 kiloton bomb code named Totem 1, at a site called MU Field, roughly 100 miles from Maralinga itself. The blast produces a radioactive cloud that Aboriginal survivors called the Black Mist, a black, oily fog that rolled more than 150 miles across the land, causing vomiting, skin rashes, sore eyes, and in at least one documented case, permanent blindness. Survivors described it decades later as shiny, thick, and strange smelling, rolling through low scrubland like something that shouldn't have been in the air at all. Before any of this happened, a patrol officer named Walter McDougall, whose entire job was clearing Aboriginal communities out of blast zones ahead of each test, raised concerns about people living downwind of the site. He was one man, driving alone across hundreds of thousands of square miles, trying to do that job by himself. In 1956, the government department running the tests wrote back that his concerns showed, and I'm quoting this directly, a lamentable lack of balance for placing the welfare of, quote, a handful of natives above the interests of the entire British Commonwealth. A royal commission decades later held that exact letter up as a symbol of everything wrong with the entire program. Here's the scale of what that program actually built. The Woomera Prohibited Area, which surrounds this test site, covers over 47,000 square miles today, down from a historical peak of more than 100,000 square miles. It is still the largest land-based weapons testing range in the entire Western world, bigger than several small countries combined, and unauthorized entry into it is a criminal offense today, carrying up to 2 years in prison. A 2014 law divided the whole area into separate access zones with published exclusion periods, and anyone who isn't an existing pastoralist or a recognized traditional owner needs a permit just to set foot inside. Inside that zone, Britain detonated 7 declared nuclear weapons between 1956 and 1963 across 2 named test series. Operation Buffalo in 1956 included 4 separate detonations. Operation Antler followed in 1957 with 3 more, the largest of them yielding close to 27 kilotons. But the declared bombs weren't even the worst part. A separate set of undeclared tests, known as the Vixen B trials, used ordinary fires and conventional explosives to disperse roughly 48 pounds of plutonium, without producing a single nuclear explosion at all. That's nearly 4 times the amount of plutonium that was inside the actual bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Historians studying this program now describe those quiet, undeclared trials as a bigger long-term hazard than the headline bomb tests people actually remember, precisely because nobody outside the program was watching for them at the time. A royal commission, led by a judge named James McClelland, investigated all of this in the mid-1980s and found roughly 100,000 plutonium-contaminated metal fragments still scattered across the site more than 25 years after testing ended. Britain's first cleanup attempt, back in 1967, buried contaminated debris in shallow trenches and plowed radioactive soil into the subsoil, and was declared good enough at the time. It wasn't. A 1984 Australian survey found the actual contamination had been underestimated by roughly a factor of 10. The real cleanup didn't happen until between 1996 and 2000, removing over 390,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil and debris at a cost of more than 100 million Australian dollars, roughly half of it paid for by the British government that created the mess in the first place. The Aboriginal people displaced to make room for all of this, the Maralinga Tiarucha, received a compensation settlement of $13.5 million in 1994, after elders traveled all the way to London the year before with contaminated soil samples to make their case in person. Their land was handed back to them in stages after that, roughly 8,100 square miles in 2004, and the final piece of the original test site itself only in 2014, 61 years after the black mist first rolled across it. Now here's the detail worth being precise about, because the honest version of this story is actually more interesting than the exaggerated one. The old bomb sites themselves have technically been open to permitted seasonal tourists since the cleanup was certified safe in 2000. You can, with the right booking, actually walk out to where those craters are. What hasn't opened at all is the vast prohibited area surrounding those craters, which remains the world's largest active, permit-gated, criminally enforced military exclusion zone right up to today. And that buffer zone exists because of one number that ties this entire desert back to the one that sat right in the middle of this list, the vanished scientist and the failed search at Lop Nur. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,110 years. 2 different empires, on 2 different continents, in 2 different decades, reached the exact same conclusion about what to do with a weapon too dangerous to keep anywhere near people. Build it in the emptiest desert on the map, and let the emptiness itself become the wall. China did it at Lop Nur. Britain did it here. Both zones are still standing guard today, and one of them, we now know, is actually still expanding. 10 deserts, spread across 4 continents and thousands of years, 10 completely different reasons. An organized force either refused to go in or went in and came out worse for it, and underneath every single one of those reasons sits the same closing math. A half-life measured in tens of thousands of years will still be counting down long after every government that ever built one of these zones is gone. Tell me in the comments which one of these 10 you'd actually go stand in first, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. If you want more of these, subscribe.